It was late spring when Adrian finally came home. The house had been quiet for months. Too quiet for a family once known for its endless noise and heated debates over the dinner table. After 3 years away for graduate school in London, Adrian had returned to his coastal hometown in Maine, full of ambition, softened by distance and accompanied by someone unexpected. His partner, Alice. Alice was quiet, refined, with a kind of subdued charm that didn't demand attention but commanded it anyway. The moment they arrived at the old family estate, with its wraparound porch and scent of lilac wafting in the breeze, Alice already felt strangely familiar to the one person who shouldn't have noticed: Adrian's younger sister, Lila. Lila was 27 now, living in the guest house after a stint in New York hadn't panned out. Once a brilliant fine arts graduate, she'd returned home to recenter. Or at least that's what she told people when they asked. Her parents traveled often. Her brother had moved away. She kept to herself most days, painting in the loft, teaching classes at the community center, walking along the cliffs when the fog allowed it. Life was slow but safe. Until that day. Until Alice. She stood at the edge of the driveway when they pulled in, barefoot in jeans smeared with cobalt and crimson paint, her dark hair twisted into a messy bun. She didn't recognize the car at first. Sleek, black, too new for Adrian, she thought. But when the door opened and she saw her brother step out, taller than she remembered, arms open, she ran to him, forgetting the years, the friction, the silence. He hugged her tightly. For a moment they were kids again, laughing in the rain, fighting over cereal, building sandcastles and dreams. But then Alice got out of the car. Their eyes met like the opening notes of a symphony, gentle, curious, and unsettling. Lila's heart stuttered. She couldn't explain it. Something about Alice's presence felt disruptive, magnetic. He was beautiful in an unconventional way. Dark curls slightly unruly, eyes the color of slate, calm like still water but impossible to read. He smiled at her politely with a softness that wasn't forced. "You must be Lila," he said. "Adrian's told me everything about you." His voice was mellow with a lilt she couldn't place. And Lila, not thinking, just nodded. "All lies, I hope." They laughed, all three of them. It was harmless. Innocent. But that first glance, between Lila and Alice, was not. The first few days passed in a blur. Adrian was ecstatic to be home, eager to show Alice all the familiar spots. The beach trail near the bluff, the old boathouse, the diner that still served the same greasy fries. Lila tried to stay out of the way. She didn't want to intrude. But Alice was different from the partners Adrian had brought home in the past. He was interested in more than just Adrian. Not romantically, no. Not openly. But in people. He asked questions, remembered answers. He noticed when Lila's mood shifted, when her paintings changed color, when she stayed silent too long. One evening, the three of them sat on the back porch, watching the sky turn lavender and gold. Adrian went in to grab wine. Alice leaned back in the chair beside Lila, his gaze on the clouds. "You paint what you feel," he said suddenly. "Not what you see." She blinked. "How do you know that?" "I saw the piece in the studio. The one with the red door and the shadows creeping in." "That's not about a place." Lila stared at him, unsettled. "No," she said slowly. "It's about something I lost." Alice nodded, quiet. "Adrian said you don't talk much about that time." "I don't." Her voice sharpened unintentionally. He didn't press. Just offered her the smallest smile, the kind that made people want to tell the truth. From that night on, Lila started to see him differently. Or maybe she always had and was only now admitting it. There was a kindness to Alice she hadn't felt in years. A patience. He listened when she spoke. He read her silences. She told herself it was admiration. Curiosity. Nothing more. But things shifted again one night when a summer storm rolled in. Adrian had gone out to visit an old friend from high school, insisting Alice stay behind. "Get to know my sister better," he'd said with a wink. It was meant to be casual. Innocent. The rain battered the windows. Lila made tea. Alice sat cross-legged on the floor of her studio, flipping through an old sketchbook of hers. "You have talent," he said without looking up. "Real talent." She shrugged. "Used to. Doesn't count if I'm not doing anything with it." "Who told you that?" He hesitated. "I did." Alice looked up. Their eyes met, and something in that gaze tightened the air between them. A pause hung in the room, heavy and breathless. Then the power flickered. They laughed nervously. The moment passed. But something had cracked open. Over the next few weeks, the three of them fell into a rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch. Afternoons apart. Evenings spent playing cards, watching old films, arguing over books and art and politics. And always, beneath the surface, the subtle tension between Lila and Ellis. Never spoken, never acted on, but undeniably present. Adrian didn't see it. Or maybe he chose not to. He was busy applying for jobs at universities, researching for his thesis. He loved Ellis deeply, that much was clear. But he also assumed loyalty where he shouldn't. Trust where there were cracks. One night he left for a week-long conference in Boston. Lila tried to stay out of Ellis's way. But it didn't work. They cooked dinner together one night. Simple pasta, wine, laughter that came too easily. Afterward they sat on the porch again, the air thick with summer heat. Music played softly from her phone. Ellis reached for her hand, not deliberately, just absent-mindedly, and she didn't pull away. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "But it's wrong." "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't cross a line. But they both knew the line had already blurred. And once that happened, there was no going back. Days passed. Adrian returned. Things returned to normal, or pretended to. But Lila found herself watching Ellis more. Noticing when he smiled, when he didn't. When he looked at her and quickly looked away. At night, she replayed conversations in her head, dissected glances, punished herself for the way her heart beat faster around him. And yet it didn't stop. Then came the night of the fundraiser, an annual town event at the art museum. Adrian was asked to speak. Lila showcased a painting. Ellis accompanied them both. They dressed up, smiled for photos, laughed for the crowd. But beneath the laughter was tension, a magnetic pull that only the two of them felt. After the event, Lila walked alone through the sculpture garden, the moon casting shadows on the stone paths. Ellis found her there. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know." They didn't kiss. Not then. But he touched her face, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. And in that moment she knew, whatever they were doing, however unspoken, it wasn't innocent anymore. They were falling into something impossible, something forbidden. And neither of them had the strength to stop it. The silence that followed the touch lingered like a storm that never quite broke. After that night in the sculpture garden, where Ellis's fingers had grazed her cheek and neither had moved away, Lila found herself haunted by every moment that had passed between them and every word they hadn't said. In the days that followed, nothing outwardly changed. She still shared breakfast with Adrian and Ellis. She still painted in her loft and walked along the fog-drenched bluffs. But inside her, everything had tilted. Something fundamental had shifted, and she no longer knew where solid ground began or ended. It wasn't guilt that consumed her, not entirely. It was the aching awareness that something real, something raw, had taken root inside her heart, and that no matter how wrong it was, it refused to die. She caught Ellis looking at her sometimes across the table, when Adrian was turned away or distracted by his phone. It was never long, just a flicker of the eyes, a tightening of the jaw, a glance that said more than 1,000 words could. But it was enough to unravel her every time. And Adrian? He seemed oblivious, or maybe just trusting, too trusting. He'd always been that way with her, always assumed she would never cross a line, never betray him. And she never had. Till now. The guilt came in waves, sharp, burning, and often in the quietest moments, like when she heard Adrian humming in the kitchen while making coffee for Ellis, or when he leaned into Ellis's shoulder during movie nights, safe in his love, unknowing. She wanted to scream sometimes. She wanted to confess. But what would she say? That she had fallen for his partner while he was pouring all his dreams into their shared life? That his sister, the one person he thought he could count on, was the very one unraveling his future from within? So instead she said nothing. She painted more. She walked longer. She drank too much wine on her porch after everyone else had gone to bed. But secrets don't sleep. They settle like dust in the corners of a room, invisible in sunlight but suffocating in the dark. And it wasn't long before the weight of silence became unbearable. One evening, while Adrian was away again, this time visiting a university in Vermont for a guest lecture, Ellis came to the studio. It was late. Lila was standing in front of a half-finished canvas, paint smeared across her hands, her face drawn in frustration. She didn't hear the door open, but she felt him before she saw him. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud, silent, dense, and heavy with anticipation. That night they didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But they stayed in the studio for hours talking, really talking, for the first time since the silence began to grow between them. Ellis told her about his childhood in rural Vermont, about his father's alcoholism, about the nights he'd slept in the back of his car to avoid the violence at home. Lila told him about the fire that had destroyed her studio in New York. The one no one knew was started by a jealous ex-lover. About the panic attacks. The loneliness. They were two damaged people, orbiting each other like moons drawn to the same dying star. When dawn came, they were still awake, and something in both of them had changed. They hadn't crossed the physical line. But emotionally, they were already gone. When Adrian returned, things felt different. Not overtly. But there were ghosts in every room now, silent reminders of what had passed and what hadn't. At dinner, Alice spoke less. Lila laughed less. Adrian noticed but said nothing. Perhaps he attributed it to stress, or the natural ebb and flow of housemates sharing space. He couldn't know that every time Alice touched his hand across the table, Lila felt a stab of something so sharp she wanted to flee the room. She started spending more time in town, volunteering at the local gallery, helping prepare for an upcoming show. She needed distance. She needed boundaries. But Alice kept finding her. A glance here. A quiet comment there. And each time her resolve thinned. Then came the night of the gallery opening. Lila had contributed 2 pieces. One new, one older. And the crowd was thicker than expected. Adrian had promised to come, but a last-minute Zoom panel had trapped him at home. Alice came alone. When Lila saw him walk in, crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled, collar open, she almost dropped her glass. He moved through the crowd like a phantom, silent, steady, eyes fixed on hers. She avoided him for an hour, chatting with donors, laughing with old classmates, doing anything to pretend the room wasn't spinning. But eventually he found her near the sculpture installation. She turned to him fully then. The tension between them had grown too big to hide behind polite nods and half-smiles. Her eyes searched his face. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I think about you when I shouldn't," he admitted. "Because when you're not in the room I feel like I can't breathe. Because when I touch Adrian I wonder if I'm lying." His words struck her like thunder. She wanted to hate him for them. But she didn't. Because she felt exactly the same. Later that night, long after the guests had left and the lights were dimmed, Lila sat alone in her car in the gallery parking lot, crying. She didn't know who she was anymore. She had never wanted to be this woman, this sister, this betrayal. But the heart doesn't care about blood ties or moral boundaries. It beats where it's pulled. The next morning everything came to a head. Adrian found a sketch in Lila's studio. An unfinished charcoal drawing of a man who looked exactly like Ellis. It wasn't a portrait. Not exactly. But the resemblance was unmistakable. He held it in silence, waiting for her to return. When she walked in and saw him standing there, her blood ran cold. He left without a word. For 3 days the house was silent. Adrian didn't speak to her. Didn't speak to Ellis. He slept in the guest room. Lila tried to apologize. Ellis tried to explain. But Adrian had shut down. She had never seen him like that, so cold, so quiet, so devastated. And the worst part was that she deserved it. Every moment. Every tear. Every broken piece. Adrian laughed bitterly. "You know what hurts the most? Not that you loved her. But that you both lied." They didn't try to stop him when he left. They knew they had already lost him. What followed were days of aching silence. The house felt hollow. The laughter that once echoed through the halls was gone. Lila tried to paint but couldn't. Alice tried to talk to her but she withdrew. They had what they wanted, freedom. But it came at the cost of everything else. And yet, even in the ruins, they found each other again. Not in joy, but in shared pain. In truth. In the rawness of 2 people who had burned down the world to be near each other. There were ghosts in every room now. Ghosts of promises broken, of love betrayed, of a brother's trust shattered. But there was also something else. Something quieter. A beginning. There was a time not long ago when the house on Ocean View Road had felt like a sanctuary, nestled between fog-shrouded cliffs and the sighing ocean winds. Its whitewashed walls and creaky floors had held the memories of a childhood marked by love, chaos, and fierce loyalty. But after Adrian's departure, after the accusations, the tears, the silence, it had become something else entirely. It had become a museum of broken things. Each room seemed to echo with what had once been. The laughter that used to bounce down the hall, the smell of fresh coffee and old books in the library, the midnight conversations on the porch, and the unspoken trust that had once been unshakable between siblings. Now only the ghosts remained. And between those ghosts stood Lila and Ellis, tethered not by joy, but by the sharp and unrelenting gravity of their choices. The days after Adrian left passed in a strange kind of haze. It wasn't peace. It wasn't freedom. It was purgatory. Lila tried to paint again, but her hands couldn't hold the brush steady. Ellis tried to write, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, but the words came out fractured, untrue. They were together, yes. But everything between them was steeped in sorrow, like wine spilled on silk, deep, staining, impossible to scrub clean. And still they could not let go of each other. There were long stretches of silence, where they would sit in the sunroom, eyes glazed over, barely speaking. Other days they fought, quietly, bitterly. Lila would accuse him of still thinking about Adrian. Ellis would accuse her of regretting everything. Neither wanted to be right. Neither wanted to lose the other. But the tension was relentless, hovering like fog that never lifted. And yet, amid the ache, they clung to each other more fiercely than ever. Because love, once begun, once fed by secret glances and forbidden touches, doesn't dissolve just because it's wrong. If anything, it becomes more urgent, more desperate. And that was what they had now. A desperate, aching, guilty kind of love. One that left bruises behind every time it touched them. Ellis moved into the guest house after Adrian left. It felt like the only thing to do. Lila stayed in the main house, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. She began repainting old canvases, as if rewriting their story through layers of color and texture. But nothing could erase the truth. And the truth was this: the man she loved had once belonged to her brother. And no matter how hard she tried to justify it, by fate, by feeling, by timing, nothing changed that central wound. She missed Adrian more than she could say. There were nights when she would open her phone and scroll to his contact, her fingers hovering over the screen, wondering what she could possibly say that wouldn't deepen the chasm between them. But every message she composed sounded hollow. Every apology felt small. So she said nothing. And the silence grew. Ellis too struggled. He tried reaching out once, an email. It was never returned. He tried calling. The call went to voicemail. The worst part wasn't the rejection. It was the knowledge that he deserved it. Because no matter how real what he and Lila shared had become, it had started in betrayal. And Adrian had been the collateral. We're the villains in his story, Lila said one night, staring into her tea. Maybe in our own too. Ellis said nothing. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been felt 100 times in the spaces between their words. But when he reached out and took her hand, she didn't pull away. In that moment, she needed to believe that love, even a flawed one, could be redemptive. That it could grow in the shadow of pain. Summer turned to autumn. The wind grew sharper, the cliffs lonelier. Leaves fell like memories, one by one, color bleeding into the grass. And still Lila and Ellis stayed. Together, yes. But always with the unspoken third presence between them, Adrian. His name was rarely spoken, but it lived in every sigh, every glance, every silence. He was the ghost in the room. One morning, Lila found a letter on the doorstep. There was no address, no return name. Just her name, Lila, in bold, hurried handwriting. She knew the penmanship immediately. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Adrian's words were not cruel. They were measured. Cold. Wounded. I hope you're well, he wrote. Or as well as one can be, having rewritten the meaning of loyalty. I'm not writing to forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'm writing to say I'm alive. I'm starting over. Somewhere new. Without you. Please don't reach out again. Not because I hate you, but because I need to learn how not to love you anymore. My whole life I thought you'd always be my safe place. I was wrong. Lila read the letter a dozen times. Each word carved into her like glass. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply folded the letter and placed it inside the drawer where she kept old family photos. And then she went for a walk. A long one. Past the cliffs. Past the town. Past the memories. Ellis didn't ask where she went. When she returned, wind-blown and hollow-eyed, he simply opened his arms and she stepped into them. And in that embrace they didn't speak. Because what could be said that hadn't already been lost? Days later, Alice asked her a question that shattered the stillness between them. "If I asked you to leave with me," he said, "would you?" She looked at him, eyes searching. "Leave where?" "Anywhere," he said. "Somewhere without ghosts." She shook her head. "They'd follow us. The ghosts aren't in the house, Alice. They're between us." He looked down. "Then how do we go on?" She stepped closer, touched his face. "By learning how to live with them." And so they did. Wasn't easy. Wasn't perfect. But it was theirs. Slowly, painfully, they rebuilt something that resembled life. They opened a small art and design studio in town. Her paintings, his architectural sketches. The locals, mostly unaware of the past, embraced the work. They became something of a quiet success. But at night, when the work was done and the house was dark, and the only sound was the ocean breathing against the rocks, they would still sometimes lie awake, backs pressed together, hearts aching under the weight of memory. Because that's the thing about love born in secret. It never loses the shape of the lie that gave it life. But not all stories are meant to be clean. Some are meant to be complicated, honest. And this was theirs. A story not about innocence, but about consequence. About love not as a light, but as a fire that burns and warms in equal measure. Between them, there would always be a space carved by Adrian's absence. But also a tenderness, deeper than most ever feel, because it had survived so much. Because it had dared, even in ruin, to exist. And as the winter came, coating the cliffs in frost and the sea in silence, Lila and Alice sat on the porch of their new home, hands entwined, not speaking. Not needing to. Between them was grief. Between them was love. And between them, always, was the ghost of what could never be undone. It was the kind of night that blurred the edges of right and wrong. A storm rolled in from the sea, not violent but steady, rain pattering against the windows like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The wind sighed through the trees, soft but insistent, like the world itself was whispering a secret too long buried. Inside the house, Lila sat alone in the kitchen, a mug of tea gone cold between her palms, eyes unfocused, heart pacing like a prisoner in a cage too small to stand in. Alice hadn't come home yet. He'd stayed late at the studio, trying to finish a commission that had dragged into a second month. Or at least that's what he'd said. But something told Lila that tonight was different. Not in a dramatic way, not like a novel or a film where everything unfolds in one sweeping moment, but in the slow ache of knowing a decision was being made somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary things. She got up, restless, pacing the kitchen in slow circles. The air in the house felt charged, as if it too were waiting for something to happen. She told herself to go to bed, to shut off the lights, to pretend she didn't care how late it was. But care she did. More than she wanted, more than she could admit. By the time Alice came through the front door, soaked to the bone and breathless from the rain, something between them had already shifted. Some wall that had barely been standing now lay in ruins, unseen but deeply felt. He paused in the doorway, shaking water from his hair, his clothes clinging to him in a way that made Lila's throat tighten. She said nothing as he kicked off his shoes, but her eyes followed every move he made. He looked exhausted, not just from the day but from the weeks, the months, from the weight of their choices pressing down like a stone between ribs. "You waited up," he said quietly as if surprised. Lila gave a slight nod. "I couldn't sleep." He moved toward her then, slow, unsure, like every step was a test of willpower. The kitchen light was dim, casting everything in a warm haze that made the edges of his face seem softer, his expression unreadable. She reached for a towel on the counter and handed it to him without speaking. Their fingers brushed. The contact lasted less than a second, but it landed like thunder between them. He took the towel, dried his face, then hesitated. "Lila," he said, her name a breath, a tremor. She met his gaze. "What are we doing?" he asked. It was the question neither of them had dared voice in weeks, maybe months. She shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But it's too late to pretend it hasn't already happened." He stepped closer. "No, it hasn't. Not really." The silence between them pulsed like a heartbeat. "But it will," she said. "Not a threat. Not a hope. His truth." He nodded. Once. Slowly. And then he crossed the final space between them. The kiss when it came wasn't explosive. It wasn't fire and fury and chaos. It was slow, gentle, terrifying in its intimacy. His lips on hers were hesitant at first, as if still asking permission. But when she didn't pull away, when she leaned into him, something inside both of them gave way. They clung to each other like lifelines in a storm, hands tangled in hair, in fabric, in skin. They didn't speak. There was no need. Their bodies told the story for them, of longing deferred, of boundaries broken, of need sharper than regret. When he lifted her onto the kitchen counter, her legs wrapping instinctively around his waist, it wasn't lust that moved them but a kind of desperate reverence. As if each kiss, each breath, was proof they were still alive after everything they'd lost. When they finally collapsed in her bed, tangled in sheets and each other, the rain still tapped against the window like a witness to their unraveling. They didn't sleep much that night. But neither of them had the courage to speak of what they had just done. Morning came slowly with a pale gray sky and the lingering scent of rain. Lila woke first, her body aching in unfamiliar ways, her heart hammering under her ribs. Ellis was still asleep beside her, his arm draped over her waist, his breathing steady. She watched him for a long time, searching his face for something she couldn't name, relief maybe, or regret. She found neither. Only peace. But peace she knew was always temporary, especially for them. When he stirred awake, he didn't flinch or pull away. He only looked at her, eyes soft, mouth parted as if to say something, and then changed his mind. She was the one to speak first. "It happened," she said. "It did," he replied. A pause. "Do you regret it?" she asked. His eyes searched hers. "No," he said. "But I know we'll pay for it." They didn't go to the studio that day. Instead, they stayed in, made breakfast together in silence, fingers brushing too often to be accidental. Everything between them had changed, and yet it hadn't. They were still Lila and Ellis, guilty and grieving and desperately tangled in something they couldn't undo. But now there was no pretending, no ambiguity. The line had been crossed, and the world on the other side of that line was colder, quieter, but also strangely clearer. Over the next few weeks, they tried to exist inside their new reality. They were careful. They didn't go out together much. In town, they kept their distance. People knew Adrian had left, but they didn't know why. And the rumors, if any, had yet to find their way into whispers. Still, Lila felt them. The eyes. The questions. The way people looked at Ellis when he stopped by the grocery store alone. She knew it wouldn't last. Secrets never do. And that thought terrified her. Not because she feared the truth, but because she feared what it would do to Ellis. To Adrian. To whatever fragile future they were trying to build on a foundation of guilt. Then one evening, while watching an old film on the porch swing, Ellis spoke again. "Do you think he'll ever forgive us?" Lila didn't answer right away. "No," she finally said. "But maybe he'll learn to forget us." Ellis looked down. "That's almost worse." "I know." The wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the scent of salt and pine and distance. "Do you love me?" she asked suddenly. He turned toward her, startled by the question but not by the answer. "Yes," he said. "I think I have for a long time. Even when you were his?" "Especially then," he said. And just like that, the truth was no longer a secret. But truth, once spoken, demands a reckoning. And the reckoning came a week later, in the form of Adrian's voice on the phone. He had called Ellis. Unexpectedly, without warning. Ellis had stepped outside to answer, and Lila had watched from the window, her chest tight, her breath shallow. She couldn't hear the words. But she saw Ellis's face. His eyes, his stillness, the way his hand trembled slightly as he held the phone to his ear. When he came back inside, he didn't speak. He sat beside her, stared at the wall. "What did he say?" she asked. Ellis looked at her hollow-eyed. "He wants to meet." And just like that, the fragile peace they'd built began to crack again. It began with a phone call and ended in silence. After weeks of no contact, no returned messages, and a heart left in pieces, Adrian's sudden voice over the phone cracked open something neither Ellis nor Lila was prepared to face. It was a short conversation, precise, emotionless, too calm to be casual. Adrian had spoken like someone who had already mourned the people they were and now returned, not for reconciliation but for truth. "We need to talk," he had said, and nothing else. No accusations. No screaming. Just that quiet, composed sentence heavy with judgment. Alice had agreed, of course. How could he not? There were things to say. Apologies that couldn't fix anything but had to be spoken anyway. Lila watched the entire exchange from behind a pane of glass, a witness to the unraveling of what they had dared to call a future. And as the days crawled by in a haze of anticipation and dread, it became clear. The walls were closing in. Guilt had always lived with them, in shadows, in stolen glances, in every quiet moment that followed joy too closely. But now it was no longer content with whispering. It shouted. Every decision that once felt like surrendering to love now reeked of betrayal. And Lila felt it most. She carried Adrian's absence like a wound, raw and pulsing, even when she was in Alice's arms. Especially then. There were mornings she would wake and feel his breath against her neck and wonder if this, whatever this was, had been worth it. Not because she didn't love Alice. She did. Helplessly, entirely. But because love that began in darkness could not bloom without being haunted by the night it was born in. Adrian's return to the town was quiet. There were no announcements, no footsteps echoing down the familiar hallway. He didn't come to the house. He didn't call again. But they heard from mutual friends, saw glimpses of him walking alone near the marina or sipping coffee in the back of the bookstore he used to frequent. Lila went numb the first time she saw him from a distance. He looked older somehow, not in years but in weight. The easy warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a distant steadiness, as if emotion itself had been wrapped and locked away. She didn't approach. Neither did he. But the air between them across the street that day crackled with everything they had left unsaid. When the meeting finally happened, it was on neutral ground. A small park near the edge of town, empty at dusk except for rustling trees and a bench too narrow to hold the weight of 3 lives. Lila didn't come. Alice had asked her not to, and she had understood. Some wars had to be fought alone. When Alice returned that night, he didn't speak at first. He poured a glass of whiskey, sat on the floor and stared out the window into the fog. Lila approached slowly, knees folding beside his. You saw him. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. And? A long silence followed. He asked me if I ever loved him, Alice finally said. And I told him yes. I told him that what we had was real. But it wasn't enough to stop what happened next. Lila felt a tightness in her chest. What did he say? He said he hoped we were worth the cost. That if we were going to betray him, we better at least survive each other. The words landed like a stone. She didn't cry. She wanted to. But there was nothing left to give. From that point on, things began to crack around them. It was subtle at first. A stiffness in Alice's posture, a quiet distance in Lila's touch. They still loved each other. But love, when placed under constant scrutiny, begins to decay in corners. The town had started to talk. Whispers followed them through grocery aisles. Friends became strangers. Acquaintances avoided eye contact. And worst of all, people began to speak Adrian's name like he was the one who had been wronged. Which of course he had been. The shame wrapped itself around Lila like a second skin. Every look felt like an indictment. Every step outside became a trial. Alice too began to withdraw. The studio work slowed. He left projects unfinished. At night he tossed in bed, mumbling apologies in his sleep. Lila tried to pull them back. Suggested weekend getaways, painting together, even revisiting the cliffs where they'd first begun to speak openly. But nothing worked. The magic, if it had ever existed, now felt dimmed. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Because if they had sacrificed everything for each other and still couldn't make it work, what then? What had it all been for? The answer came in fragments. Moments of laughter still slipped through. A shared song in the kitchen. A stolen kiss in the morning light. But they were fewer now and farther between. The walls around them weren't just closing in from the outside. They were building up from within. Then came the letter. It arrived in Alice's name, postmarked from a university in Seattle. Teaching offer. A fresh start. A way out. He didn't tell Lila at first. She found the letter folded inside a book 3 days later. When she confronted him, his eyes dropped to the floor. I wasn't going to go, he said. Then why hide it? Because I didn't want to admit that part of me wanted to. She felt the words like betrayal all over again. So that's it, she asked. You walk away again? No, he said. But maybe we both need to ask ourselves if this, if us, is something we can carry forever. That night they slept on opposite sides of the bed. No arms reaching in the dark. No whispered assurances. Just silence. Final. In the morning, Lila sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She didn't recognize herself. Not fully. The girl who had once painted joy into canvases, who had danced barefoot on the porch with music too loud and heart too open, she was gone. What remained was someone older. Someone lonelier. Someone shaped by choices she could never take back. Ellis came up behind her, eyes soft but tired. "If I stay," he said, "I need to know we can find light again. That this isn't just surviving." She met his gaze in the mirror. "And if you go? Then I need to know it won't destroy you." She turned to him, then reached for his hand. "I don't know what I need. But I know I can't lose you too." He wrapped his arms around her and held her as if trying to stitch together all the fractures time had made. "Then we fight," he whispered. "We fight for this. Even if the world doesn't." But outside their walls judgment waited. And inside their hearts the ghosts still stirred. The walls hadn't fallen yet. But they were groaning, creaking, warning. And whether love could hold them together or crush them in the collapse, only time would tell. It wasn't just the town that was turning cold. It was her too. Lila stood at the studio window one late autumn morning, watching the fog roll in from the sea like a slow-moving grief. The wind had taken the last of the yellow leaves from the maple outside, and now even the tree looked bare, stripped of warmth, stripped of memory. The days were growing shorter, and the spaces between her and Ellis had grown longer, measured not in miles but in silences, in pauses before speaking, in nights where they lay beside each other but didn't reach. She'd once imagined love to be a fire, wild and consuming, beautiful even when it burned. But now it felt more like ice, silent, creeping, still capable of damage but without the beauty of flame. The truth was simple. She had never stopped loving Ellis, but something inside her had begun to splinter. And what was worse, she couldn't tell if the fracture had begun in her heart or in her conscience. There were two of her now. The Lila that loved Ellis and clung to him like breath. And the Lila who woke up sweating from dreams of Adrian's face. His voice flat, his eyes filled with betrayal. She could still hear the words he hadn't said, the spaces in the last conversation they never had, the silence that fell between them like a guillotine. He had disappeared into a city she had never seen and become someone she would probably never know again. But she still carried him. Every memory, every childhood promise, every laugh they'd once shared on long road trips or lazy Sundays. That was the thing about blood. It didn't just bind. It branded. And now she wore Adrian's silence like a scar no one else could see. Every time Ellis touched her, she felt the weight of the brother she had lost. It wasn't guilt alone. It was mourning. Mourning something that used to be whole. Ellis too had changed. His touches were gentler now, as if afraid to ask too much. His kisses lingered longer, as though he feared each might be the last. He had stopped talking about the university offer, but Lila knew he hadn't declined it. The letter still sat on the corner of his writing desk, unopened but ever-present. She watched him from across rooms, wondering if he was already halfway gone. Was he staying out of love, or guilt? She didn't dare ask. Some questions are weapons. Some answers ruin what little is left. Their work at the studio had stalled. Paint dried in unopened tubes. Sketches yellowed on the walls. Their shared creativity, once vibrant and collaborative, had become quiet and separate. They worked in different rooms now, spoke less during lunch, and always avoided the topic that haunted them both. Adrian. Then came the night she broke. It was a Friday. The rain hadn't stopped in days and everything felt waterlogged. Her clothes, her thoughts, her soul. She stood in front of an unfinished canvas, brush in hand, but the color refused to speak. The silence around her roared louder than thunder. And then Ellis walked in holding his phone. His face was pale. Eyes wide. "It's Adrian," he said. The name struck her like a fist. "He's here. He's in town." Lila dropped the brush. "What?" "He stopped by the gallery," Ellis said. "Left a note." He handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it with trembling fingers. "I'll be at the pier tomorrow at noon. You both owe me the truth. Come or don't. Either way, I'm done running." She didn't sleep that night. Neither did Ellis. They lay in the dark, eyes wide, backs to each other, each wondering if the next day would be the end. The end of silence. The end of love. The end of them. Noon arrived too quickly. The pier was empty when they arrived, save for a gull or two perched on the wooden railing, screeching into the wind. Then they saw him. Adrian stood at the very edge, facing the water, hands in his pockets. He turned when he heard their footsteps, his expression unreadable. There was a long silence, one heavy enough to carry everything none of them had said in months. Then he spoke. "I don't want apologies," he said. "I want honesty." Lila stepped forward, her voice soft. "We never meant for this to happen." "But it did," he said, cutting her off. "And now I want to know if it was worth it." Alice spoke next. "I didn't plan it. I never stopped loving you, Adrian. But with Lila, it was different. I didn't expect it. I didn't want it. But I couldn't deny it either." Adrian looked at his sister. "And you?" He couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, could barely speak. "I love him," she said. "But I lost you. And I don't know how to live with that." Adrian's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. "Then maybe we're all just ghosts now, haunting a past that never had a chance." He walked away after that. And this time they didn't follow. The weeks that followed were the hardest yet. Everything between Lila and Alice felt suspended in purgatory. They had crossed every line, faced every truth, and still they were left with questions that tore them in two. Lila began sleeping in the guest room. Alice didn't protest. Neither of them suggested a break or a goodbye. But absence became routine. One night, Lila drove to the cliffs alone, parked and watched the tide crash against stone. Her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. Just 5 words. "Don't destroy each other too." She read it again and again until her eyes blurred. And she knew what she had to do. That night she returned to Alice and sat beside him. "I need space," she said. "Not because I don't love you, but because I need to know who I am without the weight of what we've done." His eyes filled with pain. "Are you leaving me?" "No," she said. "I'm finding me. And if you still want us when I do, I'll come back." He didn't try to stop her. He only kissed her forehead, slow and soft. "Find yourself," he whispered. "I'll be here. Even if just as a memory." Truth is not always a lightning strike. Sometimes it unravels slowly, thread by thread, until you're left standing in the ruins of everything you thought you knew. That was how it happened for Lila. In the quiet days after she left Ellis, after she closed the door to the only love that had survived the fire of betrayal, she began to feel the contours of her truth changing. She had moved into a small apartment over a bookstore 2 towns over, surrounded by yellowing pages and the soft hum of forgotten stories. The silence was new. Not the kind that smothered like the one that had clung to the house after Adrian left, but a silence born of solitude, of self. For the first time in months, she could breathe. She filled her days with walking, painting, volunteering at a local gallery, and slowly, very slowly, learning how to exist outside the gravity of Alice's presence. But no matter how far she went, the past followed. Because truth, especially the kind born of betrayal, does not let go. It lingers. It wakes you at night. It bleeds into everything. Lila had once believed that love would redeem them. That if she and Alice loved each other hard enough, honestly enough, they could survive the storm. But what she had failed to understand was that love could not erase the foundation it was built on. It could only make you forget the cracks until the structure collapsed. And collapse it had. She felt it now in every corner of her new life. The absence not just of Alice's arms, but of the version of herself who had once believed she could take love without consequence. That girl was gone. In her place stood someone quieter, wearier, but more aware. She had begun to ask the questions she had been too afraid to ask before. Did she love Alice? Or did she love the idea of being chosen after a lifetime of being second? Did he love her? Or had he simply clung to her as a raft in the emotional wreckage left behind by Adrian's absence? Most of all, had they ever really stood a chance? Letters arrived from Alice now and then, handwritten, full of honesty and ache. He never begged her to come back, never tried to make her feel guilty. He simply told her where he was, what he was learning about himself, and how he still thought of her every time it rained. She kept the letters in a drawer beside her bed but never responded. Not because she didn't love him, but because she didn't yet know if love was enough. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs she had brought with her, she found one of her and Adrian as teenagers. It was taken the summer their parents had gone through their divorce. She remembered how, even then, Adrian had wrapped an arm around her shoulder as if to say, "I've got you even if the world breaks." And she had believed him. That bond had been the one unshakable truth of her life, until she shattered it herself. The guilt came in waves. She had hurt him more deeply than she had realized. Not just by falling for Alice, but by lying. By becoming the very betrayal they had promised never to be to each other. She wondered if he would ever forgive her. She wondered if she even deserved it. It was then that she decided to return, not to the house, not to Alice, but to Adrian. To speak. To ask. To finally uncover whatever truth was still hiding beneath the silence between them. She found him in Seattle, teaching a graduate seminar on ethics and conflict. She didn't write ahead. She didn't call. She just showed up on a quiet Thursday afternoon, hands sweating, heart pounding. The campus was calm. The sky overcast. A mirror to her mood. She waited outside the lecture hall, her breath shallow, watching him through the glass. He looked older. Sharper. But also somehow softer. As if time had worn his rage down into something more reflective. When the class ended and he stepped into the hallway, his eyes met hers instantly. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, Lila. Her name was not angry. Not warm. Just. Oh. He swallowed. "Can we talk?" He nodded, wordless, and led her outside. There are moments in life that fracture time before and after. Moments that burn so brightly, so destructively, that nothing resembling normalcy can exist once they've passed. For Lila, the explosion didn't happen with a scream or fists pounding on doors. It began in stillness. It began with the weight of too many truths left unsaid, too many days spent navigating silence like a minefield. She had returned from Seattle with her heart split open. Not by Alice or even by Adrian, but by herself. By the woman she had become through pain, desire, shame, and love. She had changed, yes. But change doesn't come without cost. And sometimes what gets destroyed in the process can never be rebuilt. The letter from Alice, left at her door, had sat unopened for hours, burning a hole in her desk with its quiet finality. When she did finally open it, her hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of knowing the decision it called for. He had waited for her. Again. At the cliffs where everything had begun. Where stolen glances had turned into stolen hours. Where loyalty had turned into longing. Where everything had started to unravel. She went. Of course she went. The air at the cliffs was thick that day, heavier than usual. The sea churned beneath the rock, waves clawing at the shore as if the earth itself was restless. And there he was, Alice, standing at the edge in his dark coat, arms crossed, the collar turned up against the wind. When he turned and saw her, something in his posture loosened. But the smile that tried to form on his lips never made it past his eyes. She approached slowly, like walking toward something sacred and dangerous all at once. They stood in silence for a long time, two shadows cast by choices neither could undo. Then finally she spoke. "I saw him." Alice nodded. "I know. It didn't change how I feel about you," she said. "But it changed how I feel about myself." He didn't respond at first. When he did, his voice was barely a whisper. "Did you find your truth?" "I found pieces of it," she replied. "And some of those pieces were broken." His eyes closed for a moment as though bracing for impact. "Do you still love me?" The question shattered the silence. "I do," she said. "But love doesn't make the fire any less destructive." Alice stepped closer, searching her face. "Then what are we? What have we become?" She didn't answer. Instead she reached for his hand. "I think we're the wreckage. And the question is whether we still want to build something from it, or walk away." The wind howled, almost like a voice between them, forcing the choice. They left the cliffs together that evening, but not in the way they had imagined. There were no promises. No declarations. Only understanding. And in some ways, that was more intimate than anything they'd shared in the months before. But the universe, it seemed, was not done with them. The explosion came not from within, but from outside. It was a Thursday. Late afternoon. The gallery had just closed when a figure walked through the door without knocking. Adrian. He stood in the foyer like a storm made human, still, unreadable, charged with energy that made the walls themselves seem to tremble. Alice froze. Lila turned, her heart plummeting to her stomach. She hadn't expected him. Not like this. Not now. But the look on Adrian's face said everything. "You're still together," he said. It wasn't a question. Lila stepped forward slowly. "Adrian, don't," he snapped, voice low, dangerous. "Don't say you didn't mean for this to happen again. Don't say you're sorry. Just," he paused, inhaling sharply as if holding back something explosive. "I told myself I could live with what you did. That I could let go. That I could be the bigger person." His voice cracked. "But watching you here, together, pretending to be whole, that's the part one can't stomach." Alice tried to speak. "We never meant to." "You never meant to what?" Adrian roared. "To love each other? To ruin the only family I had left?" The room was thick with it now. Rage, sorrow, betrayal so deep it had calcified into something sharp. "I lost 2 people that day," Adrian said, voice trembling. "My partner. My sister. And every day since I've tried to figure out how to stop hating you." Lila felt the tears coming fast, hot, useless. "I'm not asking you to forgive us," she said. "I know I don't deserve that. But I need you to know it wasn't about choosing him over you. It was about discovering something in myself I didn't know was there." Adrian laughed, bitter and hollow. "Well, congrats. You discovered it. And it cost you everything." Then Alice stepped forward. "Adrian, if it means anything, if it ever meant anything, I loved you. I still do in some way. But we were unraveling before Lila. You just didn't see it." "No," Adrian said. "You just didn't say it." His eyes went to Lila one last time. "And you? I hope you find what you're looking for. I really do. But I can't be in your life anymore. Not even as a memory." And with that he turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him like a final verdict. That was the explosion. The moment the world cracked open. And when the dust settled, nothing looked the same. After that day, things between Lila and Alice became delicate. Not broken but brittle. They moved around each other with caution, like survivors in a burned house afraid to touch the walls. They tried to keep going, work, meals, quiet evenings, but something had shifted irreversibly. The guilt that had once been background noise was now thunder. And even love, as fierce and true as it had been, struggled to breathe under the weight of what had just been lost, again. Lila found herself withdrawing, not out of anger but exhaustion. The past wouldn't let her go. It wrapped itself around her thoughts, her sleep, her creativity. She began spending nights alone again, not as punishment but as retreat. Alice didn't fight it. He seemed to understand. Maybe he felt it too, the ache of something beautiful turning into something unbearable. One evening, as she packed up a painting to deliver to a client, she found a note from Alice slipped under her supplies. It was short. "You've always been the truest thing in my life. But sometimes even truth comes too late. If you decide to stay, I'll build with you. But if you need to go, I won't ask you not to. Whatever you choose, I will never regret us." She cried that night. Not because of pain. Not because of loss. But because, in a way, that note was love at its purest. A release. A blessing. A truth without expectation. She didn't give him an answer right away. Some questions deserved to live in the quiet for a while. And so, in the aftermath of the explosion, she sat in her studio late into the night, brush in hand, painting the only thing that made sense. Not a face, not a memory. In the weeks following Adrian's final goodbye, the world seemed to fold into a kind of muted gray. Nothing collapsed all at once. There was no dramatic scene, no storm to wash everything away. Instead, it was quieter than Lila had expected. A slow erosion. Like a tide pulling gently at the shore, taking grains of sand one at a time until the whole foundation softened beneath her feet. There were still mornings, there was still coffee, she still fed the cat and answered emails and painted occasionally, but the world felt hollowed out. As though everything she once believed had been stripped away, leaving behind only breath, motion, routine. Alice still came by some days, though never uninvited, always pausing before entering, like someone approaching a shrine they're not sure they're worthy to enter. They didn't touch much anymore. Not because love had died, but because it had weathered so much that it was now tender, bruised, too fragile to lean on too heavily. Some evenings they shared dinner, a movie, a quiet glass of wine, and in those silences between them lived the unspoken acknowledgement that they were two people who had walked through a war together, but who now didn't know what to do in the silence after the battle. Lila began writing again, though not in her journal. She wrote letters, long, sprawling letters that she never sent. Letters to Adrian. To Ellis. To herself. She wrote about the moment she first felt Ellis's hand brush hers and how that spark had terrified her more than anything she'd ever known. She wrote about Adrian's face when he found out, the tremble in his jaw as if the betrayal hadn't just cracked him open but rewritten who he thought she was. She wrote about guilt, how it lived under her skin, quiet and pulsing. But also about clarity, how something in all of this had forced her to look inward and ask herself questions that she'd buried her entire life. Who was she when no one loved her? Who was she when she wasn't fighting to be chosen, to be seen, to be held? The town had gone quiet too. The whispers had died down. Or maybe she'd just stopped listening. She no longer felt the burn of stares in grocery stores, no longer paused when her name echoed faintly in a hushed conversation. She had outlived the worst of it. Not forgiven perhaps, but endured. And there was power in that. Quiet power. Resilience. She started volunteering at an art class for troubled teens. Kids who didn't know how to speak what they felt but could scream it out with color and canvas. And something in their raw honesty reminded her of herself. Reminded her that pain, when acknowledged, can be turned into something not just survivable but transformative. They painted like their lives depended on it. And maybe they did. One evening, Alice sat beside her on the porch steps of her small apartment, watching the sun melt behind the horizon in streaks of orange and gray. He didn't speak for a long time. Neither did she. The silence was comfortable now, not heavy. Finally, he said, "I put in my resignation at the gallery." Lila turned to him, startled. "Why?" "Because I'm moving," he replied. "I accepted a position at a small art program on the coast. It's quieter. Simpler. Maybe a place I can rebuild." She nodded slowly, digesting the words. "When?" "End of the month." The ache bloomed in her chest. Not panic, not grief. Just a slow sadness. "Will you be okay?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "I think I need to find out who I am without the wreckage." She took a long breath, nodded again. "I understand." That night after he left, she stood in front of the mirror and said the words out loud. "I love him." But love isn't always enough. It was the first time she believed it. Truly believed it. And the first time it didn't destroy her. That was the thing about Aftermath. It's not about dramatic exits or conclusions. It's about learning how to breathe again. About learning how to live with what remains. In the space that followed Alice's departure, Lila began to grow again. Not in loud, obvious ways, but in subtleties. In the way she smiled at strangers again, in the way she filled her apartment with light, in the way she picked up her paintbrush not out of obligation but curiosity. Adrian never called, never wrote. But she began to feel his absence less like a wound and more like a room in her memory she no longer visited daily. She knew forgiveness might never come. And that was okay. Some truths lived outside absolution. What mattered more was that she had forgiven herself. Bit by bit. Layer by layer. That she had learned to face herself in the mirror and not flinch. The gallery invited her to submit a solo collection. It was the first professional opportunity she had said yes to in months. The show was titled Fragments. Each piece was an echo of her journey. Abstract, visceral, flawed. But honest. Unapologetically honest.